I'm honored to be here and to have this opportunity to share with you some thoughts about what makes a person a hero. But first, I want to say that something that Kim said at the early part of her remarks really resonated with me when she talked about how so many of the ideas that all of us here believe in are not being heard where they ought to be heard, in schools in particular. This is something we're trying to address at FEE, Foundation for Economic Education. But as I was telling my friend Kathy Smith this morning, the most common remark of the students, high school and college students who attend our events, thousands of them at our half-day, one-day, full-day, three-day conferences throughout the year, most common response at the end of those events is, "I never heard this before." And all we do is talk about the ideas that made our country great, the ideas that in fact make any great country great, the ideas without which no great country can remain great, ideas of liberty and free markets and private property and personal character. You would think that in a country that was founded upon these principles, that you wouldn't have very many students say by the age of 20 or 21 that they're hearing these things for the first time. But that's the challenge that we face because it's commonplace throughout the country. Before I talk to you about heroes and heroism, I want to share with you a favorite passage of scripture of mine. I'm guessing that all of you here have favorites as well. Maybe this will be the favorite of someone here too, I don't know. But it summarizes my message, I think, so well. It's from 2 Timothy 1:7. And it reads, "For God did not give us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline." That's a great message, isn't it? One that I think all of us should take from this convention and that should motivate all that we do hereafter. For God did not give us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. And the people I want to tell you about this morning were great exemplars of those character traits, as I hope you'll see before I'm all finished. Why talk about heroes and heroism? Well, in my belief, this is how we learn. This is how we grow. As human beings, we are incredibly inspired by the people around us, the people who set the examples. And they are not the common people either. I think we don't spend enough time celebrating the uncommon amongst us. In fact, I know that some of you who were at our FECON conference last year, you remember me making this point at that conference, that there are too many celebrations of the common man or the common woman these days. It's the uncommon we ought to be celebrating, the ones who stand out from the crowd, who exhibit great courage, who do things differently because it's the right thing to do, even if the crowd is moving in the other direction. It's the uncommon people that really make the world go round. I can't imagine a good parent telling a son or daughter, "You should work hard so that someday you can become common." In my mind, that's a bit like, that's almost child abuse, isn't it? I mean, you should be telling your child, be uncommon, be different, be better, be the best you can be, stand out from the crowd, don't try to just blend in, speak truth to power when you have the opportunity. Help move society in the right direction by standing courageously for all the things you know to be right. When a person rushes into a burning building and saves a child's life, we say that person is a hero. And I would as well. There's nothing of that act that would prompt me to in any way give it less than its due. But the kind of hero that I like to talk about, and is the subject of the book that Kim mentioned, Real Heroes, is a hero who lives a heroic life every day of the week. It may be punctuated by spectacular moments of heroism, but it's in a more quiet way that a genuine hero exhibits heroism from day to day, month to month, year after year. What are the kind of traits of character that define a hero? Or at least, I realize that this is a bit subjective. Different people may have different criteria, but I want to tell you what mine are. In my mind, a person of heroic quality is a person of solid character. And by character, I mean the following. We use that term a number of different ways, don't we? Sometimes we say, he's a character. But you can be one and not necessarily have any. They're not quite the same. Character, in my belief, and I mean it in the most positive sense, is a collection of traits, of personality traits, that almost everybody, if you press them, would have to say, even if they fall short, that they would like to see a world in which those things are more widely practiced. Even a thief will tell you, if you press him and he's genuinely honest for a moment, he would say, well, yeah, I know I'm stealing, and I guess that's all right for me, but I don't want you to steal from me. It only works for him. But if pressed, he would have to admit what he's practicing certainly doesn't have universal value. I think among the traits that define solid character and at the same time are indispensable to the maintenance of a free society, among the most important is honesty. Can you imagine a free society in the absence of an honest people? Just imagine what that would be like. If you lived in a world where people by and large put no premium on the truth, they don't stand for it because of its own sake or for its own value. In fact, they'll break their word, they'll lie and deceive, they'll cheat, they'll cut corners and prevaricate the moment they think that it might be of some advantage to them, at least in the short run. Can you imagine if that were an attitude widely practiced in society? What would things look like? You'd have chaos, right? If you couldn't keep another person's, you couldn't keep them to their word. You never knew whether they were lying to you or not. Or even if they were honest for the moment, whether they would be tomorrow. We would be in chaos, and history has shown us time and again that chaos produces the strong man. Somebody comes in on the white horse, knocks heads together, and brings order out of the chaos, and there go your liberties. And honest people have a shot at being a free people. And dishonest people do not. So I think that's critically important. And by the way, have you ever noticed that these qualities, honesty in particular, are not prerequisites for a socialized or collectivized society? In fact, the more dishonest the people are, the more they are candidates to live under a collectivized or socialized environment. That's likely what they'll get. If they can't keep their word, if they're not honest to their fellow citizens or to themselves, they will degenerate into some kind of tyranny, almost inevitable. Another quality of character that we see in heroes, to varying degrees, but the really good ones certainly have a lot of this, is intellectual humility. That's a mouthful, but it's just another way of saying the understanding that as much as you may know, you recognize there's still a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know. Learning is a lifelong, or ought to be a lifelong endeavor. You will never reach the point, no matter how many degrees you may have after your name, where you can say, I know all that there is to know, or all that I need to know. On the day that you check out, there'll be as much out there in the way of knowledge you don't know as there was when you started. That's the nature of the universe. When you understand that, it makes you a bit humble, doesn't it? You realize, hey, I'm not a know-it-all after all. And it tends to make you introspective. It makes you focus on self-improvement. It makes you realize that as much as you may know, there's still so much out there that it's a bit humbling to recognize that. Our founder at FEE, a man named Leonard Read, no relation, years ago wrote a great little essay called I, Pencil. And he tells the story of how a pencil comes into being as if the pencil is doing the talking. And to make a long story short, you can read this on our website, fee.org, if you type in I, Pencil. The pencil basically says, well, my eraser comes from a substance that grows in trees in Malaysia, and the wood has to be of a certain kind. You have to know how to log it and how to cut it. And the graphite comes from beneath the earth, but only in certain places. You have to have all these incredible skills that then come together as if by magic in a marketplace, not by central command. There's nobody cracking the whip saying you must make pencils because the peasants want to write. It just happened because of the free interplay of things like supply and demand, free exchange, people serving others, and thereby in that process serving themselves, improving their well-being. And as a result, there's not a single person in the world who knows how to make a pencil. That may sound pretty remarkable, but it's true. If somebody told you, you cannot rely upon any skill, any knowledge from any other person, you gotta start completely from scratch and go make a pencil. Not a single person could do it. You'd have to be a logger, you'd have to be a miner, you'd have to be a metallurgist, you'd have to be any number of things that all come together in the marketplace. Well, what does that say? If no one person entirely by himself knows how to make a pencil, what does that say about any one or even a number of people and their ability to plan an economy of 325 million people? Self-improvement ought to be a full-time responsibility. If you want to reform the world, you've got to reform yourself first, and that's a full-time job. Washington, D.C. is not a humble place, but it could use some humility, couldn't it? Some recognition that, hey, you guys don't necessarily know anywhere near all that you would need to know to plan the lives of your fellow citizens. Get over it. So intellectual humility is an important aspect of a hero. One who is humble knows to leave other people alone, to work with them freely and voluntarily and peacefully, to respect their lives and their property and their choices. Another attribute of good character and of heroism is responsibility. Can you imagine a society of people who are not responsible, who don't believe in responsibility? What would that look like? You'd have people fleeing from accountability. You'd have people say, well, whether I made that mistake or not is irrelevant. We need to make you pay. It's your fault. You owe me a living. Give me a bailout. A society of irresponsible people would be people who never step up to the plate and say, you know, I made a mistake. I'll learn from it and not do it again. An irresponsible person doesn't do that. An irresponsible person just keeps on making the mistakes and pointing the finger of blame at other people for them. I don't see how freedom can survive in a society of irresponsible people. Courage is another important attribute. All you have to do is look at the history of the world for a few moments and you discover that the numbers of people who have lived in any significant measure of freedom are pretty small. It's a rare and precious thing. The great majority of people who have ever lived, including those living today, have lived under serfdom or as slaves or in some system in which they've had to be in constant fear of saying or thinking or doing something that those with political power might object to. That's the way most people have lived and are still living today. So if you believe in liberty, you've got to recognize, first of all, how rare and precious it is, and that timidity isn't going to get it for you. In a dangerous world, courage is a necessity for those who believe in liberty. And people have had to put their lives on the line and take other risks to speak truth to power over the ages. Well, those are some, but not all, of the character traits important to heroism. I really want to focus the rest of my talk on specific heroes. They're all in the book, Real Heroes. You can get it at our website store for $7, I think it is. Amazon wants twice that, but get it cheaper from us. Let me share with you several stories from the book. The first one is of a woman who lived at the time of the American War for Independence. How many of you have heard of Mercy Otis Warren? Okay. There was a day maybe a century ago, and certainly before, when every American knew who Mercy Otis Warren was. She earned a reputation in her day as the conscience of the American Revolution. Mercy Otis Warren was a playwright. She was an author. She was an occasional public speaker. And perhaps above all else, she was a courageous advocate of liberty and a principled advocate of liberty. In the run-up to the War for Independence, the first shot of which was fired in 1775, Mercy Otis Warren for years was counseling courage and principle. And she said many times, if our conflict with the mother country should come to war, let it be a conflict rooted in principle. Let it be a conflict which stands for something. And to her, that meant individual liberty, private property, defense of the rights of men and women. It wasn't just, let's go after George III and get rid of him. It was, let's stand for something worth fighting for, the principles of liberty. The Sons of Liberty and the committees of correspondence, so active in the years before the war to encourage a groundswell for liberty, often met in her living room, in her home in Massachusetts. Some of the key meetings of the leadership of those organizations, meeting in the home of Mercy Otis Warren. This was incendiary. This was dangerous. George III and his troops would have come down on them at any of these occasions if they'd known what was transpiring in her front living room. She was an outspoken critic of George III, knowing full well that she was putting herself in the line of fire, especially after 1775. During the war, she was constantly encouraging men and women to hold up in the face of great hardship. Because they were on the right side. They were fighting for something worth fighting for. When the war was over, she could have retired, I suppose, and said, well, I'll go back to writing plays. But she took an early and important role in the formation of American government. In the 1780s, 1787 in particular, Mercy Otis Warren was a powerful influence over the men who gathered at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. She was one of the first to say, do not pass this Constitution until it incorporates a Bill of Rights. She was one of the strongest advocates for strengthening the early versions of the Constitution with a Bill of Rights. She was also, by the way, the first person to write a history, a comprehensive history of the period during in the American colonies of the period leading up to the war with England from 1760 to 1775. It was an amazing history that President Thomas Jefferson, while Mercy Otis Warren was still living, required of his cabinet to own and to read. The conscience of the American Revolution. Why do we not hear of her today? Maybe because she stood for all the right things. Another woman I want to tell you about is one who will be on the, I think it's the $10 bill, maybe 20. Can't recall which of the two they settled on, but she'll soon adorn the American currency, either the $10 or $20 note. You've all heard the name Harriet Tubman, right? I want to tell you a little bit about her, maybe something you haven't heard before. Harriet Tubman was the most renowned conductor of the Underground Railroad pre-Civil War, which was not technically a railroad at all. It was a network of trails and river passages that ferried slaves at great risk to anyone involved to freedom in northern states and in some cases to Canada. Harriet Tubman was born a slave in Maryland in the 1820s. She grew up as a slave, lived as one for her first 29 years. There was an episode early in her life that left a lasting mark on her. Her slave master, I don't know what the origin of the altercation was, but nonetheless he hit her in the head with a metal object that left her with periodic migraines and blurry vision for decades thereafter. I'll come back to that a little later. But finally, at the age of 29, Harriet Tubman had had enough. And at great risk to herself, she looked for an opportunity and made her escape. And it was successful. She made her way to Philadelphia, a city of brotherly love. But the important thing about Harriet Tubman was, and this is what makes a hero quite frequently, certainly a hero for liberty, is that she wasn't simply interested in her own liberty, she was interested in the liberty of others as well. So she's now a free person in Philadelphia. What does she do? She immediately says to herself, I'm going to do what I can to liberate others who, like me at one time, was a slave. I want to share with you the way she put that in her own language. She said, I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in the old cabin quarter with the old folks and my brothers and sisters. But to this solemn resolution I came. I was free, and they should be free also. I would make a home for them in the north, and the Lord helping me, I would bring them all here. Oh, how I prayed then, lying all alone on the cold, damp ground. Oh, dear Lord, I said, I haven't got no friend but you. Come to my help, Lord, for I'm in trouble. Oh, Lord, you've been with me in 6 troubles. Don't desert me in the 7th. But she ventured 13 times back into slave states to escort, at enormous risk, almost 70 slaves to their freedom in northern states. Years later, the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass said this about her. This was in 1868. What a great tribute from a great man to a great woman. He wrote, most that I have done and suffered in the service of our cause has been in public, but I have received much encouragement at every step of the way. You, on the other hand, have labored in a private way. I have wrought in the day, you in the night. I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes of being approved by the multitude, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scarred, and footsore bondsmen and women, whom you have led out of the house of bondage, and whose heartfelt God bless you has been your only reward. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism. Well, for several decades, Harriet Tubman worked as a volunteer after the Civil War to improve the lot of former slaves. She was a great advocate for women's rights. She was a great advocate for people to pitch in and help the disadvantaged. And in the 1890s, something happened that underscores how tough Harriet Tubman was. I mentioned earlier about the incident when she was young, being hit in the head with that metal object. In her 70s, in the 1890s, Harriet Tubman decided to have brain surgery to see if the doctors could relieve some of those symptoms. Now, that would be risky in and of itself, right? In the 1890s, brain surgery, that wasn't very far along just yet, but to top it all off, Harriet Tubman told the doctors, don't give me any of that anesthesia. She said, just give me a bullet to bite on. What a tough bird. And she endured brain surgery with nothing but a bullet to bite on as anesthesia. And she lived another 15 years with those symptoms largely relieved. And she was fond of giving talks at which she would mention her brain surgery. And I have the exact quote in the book, but I'm pretty close when I tell you that she liked to say, yeah, they took the top of my head off and played around in there, put the top back on, and now I feel just fine. What a tough bird she was from start to finish. But the amazing thing about her, again, was her interest in the freedom of others, not just of herself. Another lady I want to tell you about. I'll bet more people here know this name than perhaps the previous two. How many of you have heard the name Fanny Crosby? Okay, an amazing woman. I'll tell you several things about her and leave the most amazing thing about her to the last. Fanny Crosby passed away only 102 years ago last February, in February of 1915, at the age of 95. She was born in 1820, lived to 1915. Fanny Crosby in the 1870s made a name for herself, at least throughout New England. When New York City was hit with a cholera epidemic, thousands fled the city. She stayed behind and nursed and ministered to the sick, contracted cholera herself, but recovered. If that's all she'd ever done, she'd be at least a footnote in New York City history, or Northeastern history, because that was regarded as a brave and wonderful thing to have done. But she's famous for so much more. Fanny Crosby was the first woman to address the United States Congress. That tells you, wow, well, it must have been a reason for that. What could she have done to catch the attention of the members of Congress? Fanny Crosby also holds the record for having met more American presidents than any other man or woman living or dead. Mr. Trump is number 45. How many presidents, either when they were in the office or in some cases afterwards, how many American presidents do you think record holder Fanny Crosby met? Any guesses? Wouldn't you agree that if she had met 5 or 6, that would be quite remarkable? She met 21. She met almost half the people who have served as president. Every president from John Quincy Adams through and including my least favorite, Woodrow Wilson. A little commentary on the side for another day. Now, John Quincy Adams, you might say, well, how could she have met him? He was president way back in the 1820s. After he served one term as president, he went on to serve 17 years in the House of Representatives from Massachusetts, and it was late in those years that Fanny Crosby met him. Met every president, from John Quincy Adams to Woodrow Wilson. Wow, something about her must have really caused those people to want to seek her out. She still holds the record in another regard, too. She wrote the lyrics to more songs than anyone else in human history. In her case, they were almost all hymns. She wrote almost 9,000 hymns. And on any given Sunday today, more than a century since her passing, I wouldn't be surprised if there are maybe several million Americans and others around the world singing Fanny Crosby hymns like Blessed Assurance, To God Be the Glory. 9,000 hymns. She had an amazing memory, by the way. There's a great story, you can read it in any of the several biographies of her, about her memory. She was contacted by a music company once, and whoever it was that contacted her said, we've got the music for 40 songs, we just don't have the words. Can you compose them, and we'll contract with you to do that. She did it all in her head, all 40 songs, shows up and simply dictates the lyrics to 40 hymns on the spot, no notes. Remarkable woman. But I didn't tell you the most incredible thing about her. She never had any memory of having seen anything. She was completely blind from the age of 6 months. Never saw a thing. Now, do you think she would live a life of anguish and complaint? You might not blame her if she had, but not in Fanny Crosby's case. In fact, she would often talk about what she thought, what a blessing it was. She made the comment on multiple occasions about how she couldn't imagine all the things that she would have missed had she been given the gift of sight. Is that a positive outlook on life or what? And when she spoke to Congress, you know what her message was? It was not, I have a handicap, where's my check? Her message was, we are all called to be the best we can be at whatever we can do, to overcome whatever the obstacles we face may be to the extent we can, to leave the world a better place, to leave it freer or better or both if we can, to be a good example for the people around us, to live a good life, to cause people to say on the day we check out, well done, thy good and faithful servant. That was Fanny Crosby's message, and she was able to say that and preach that and sing that all over the country because she lived it. You cannot impart what you don't possess, and she possessed it. She lived it from day one. Another woman I want you to know is of more recent times. Has anyone here heard of Vivian Kellems? Kellems. She only passed away in 1975, so she was around within the lifetimes of some of us here in this room. Vivian Kellems in the 1920s was an inventor. She invented what became known as the Kellems cable grip. It was a device that enabled heavy cables for like suspension bridges to be lifted and transported. Later, it was adapted by Vivian Kellems to be able to lift artillery shells during World War II. And she had big contracts with the U.S. government during the war. That's when she began to realize government doesn't always operate the way it ought to. And from the inside, as a contractor, she saw all kinds of waste and fraud and bureaucratic delays and what have you. And she began to speak out against it. President Franklin Roosevelt didn't like that and tried to sick the IRS on her, but never got anywhere, at least at that point. She really made the news, however, when Harry Truman was president, and withholding of taxes from employee payrolls became compulsory. To Vivian Kellems, by that point a multimillionaire entrepreneur and businesswoman, she started her own business to market the cable grip she had invented. She was quite a successful businesswoman, and all of a sudden the government tells her, you've got to be an unpaid tax collector for us. Her point was, wait a minute, why should I be an unpaid tax collector for the government? And why shouldn't the government tell people directly what it wants from them? Maybe send them the bill once a year so they really understand what government is costing them. So she went on a national rampage, you might say, to get the American people to understand this is a stealth way of getting us to buy into a lot more government. If they take your money before you ever see it, you're not going to realize fully just how big it is. And she made the famous remark during a big speech to a large audience in Chicago. She said, if high tax Harry wants to make me a tax collector for his government, he better give me a badge. Well, she fought compulsory withholding all the way up until an unfavorable decision of the U.S. Tax Court in 1973. So she lost that one. But boy, did she fight the good fight, and it was based on principle. But she won some other fights. She was opposed to intrusive government, no matter what level it came from. And so I want to tell you one more thing about her. In the 1950s, the state of Connecticut passed a law that made it illegal for women to work after 10 p.m. Women could not legally work in the state of Connecticut after 10 p.m. Well, Kellems had a huge factory, lots of female employees. She had no night shift, so you might say, well, wouldn't have affected her anyway. But to her, this was a matter of principle. She thought the Connecticut government has no business telling women when they can and when they can't work. So she rounded up hundreds of her employees, mostly women, and she said, let's have a night shift. And they showed up hoping that the cops would come, so she'd have standing in court if they tried to close them down. And to her disappointment, the cops didn't show up. They didn't want to tangle with her. And so day after day, these night shifts went, cops never showed up. she decides, well, I got to press this, so I have standing to challenge the law. So here's this multimillionaire woman who goes out and gets a job herself as a waitress at an all-night diner and holds a press conference and says, come and get me. And within 2 days, the Connecticut legislature passed a law repealing the ban on women working after 10 p.m. They just did not want to tangle with Vivian Kellum. She had a righteous cause, and she argued from principle. She knew her Constitution, and she made her case. I'm about out of time, am I not? I was going to tell you another story, but Kim, are you here? Okay. Am I to end? Okay. I'll kind of condense it though. This is not a story of a woman, but it's of a man that I knew who passed away only 2 years ago, last July, at the age of 106. Oldest person I've ever known, sharp to the end, celebrated the world over for what he did in 1938 and 39, knighted by Queen Elizabeth for it, even though the world didn't really know much about it for a good 50 years after he did it. His name was Nicholas Winton, W-I-N-T-O-N. One of the most remarkable people I have ever come across or come to know. Nicholas Winton was a 29-year-old stockbroker in London in 1938. That was the last full year of peace before the outbreak of World War II. That was a momentous year. In March of 38, Hitler gobbled up Austria. Then he began to rattle his saber against Czechoslovakia, demanding the border area called the Sudetenland. The Western Allies, along with Hitler, gathered at a place called Munich for a big conference to try to settle the issue. And France and Britain basically gave in to him and said, okay, if you go ahead and take the Sudetenland, promise us that you won't go any further and we will not go to war. And so now, to this day, the word Munich is thought, politically speaking, in terms of appeasement, because appeasement was what happened at that conference. Well, shortly after that conference, the world breathed a sigh of relief. A lot of people thought we dodged a bullet, war had been averted. Not Nicky Winton. He knew that Hitler had ambitions that would not stop with the Sudetenland. But he nonetheless planned a vacation. At Christmas time, 1938, he was going to go to Switzerland. But a friend of his, who was working in the British Embassy in Prague, said, hey, Nicky, don't go to Switzerland, come here. There's something I've got to show you. And so he prevailed on him, he came to Prague, and what his friend wanted him to see were the refugee camps, full of thousands of mostly Jewish families with children. They had fled the Sudetenland, some had even fled Poland and Germany, and here they were stuck in these freezing conditions, these makeshift camps at the onset of winter, no place to go. No country would recognize that they were even in danger. We signed an agreement, you're not in any trouble. But the Jewish families especially knew that Hitler would not be satiated, that they were in harm's way. What do you suppose Nicky found? What did those parents say to him as he walked through the camps? Perfect stranger. They come up to him time and again and beg him, please take our children. Can you get our children out? We can't get out. Can you get the children somehow to safety? You can imagine the desperation that a parent faces to be so willing to give to a perfect stranger their children. Nicky could have said, well, sorry, I'm only one person. I'm supposed to be on vacation. I have other things to do. What can one person possibly do? Good luck. But he was a man of character. He immediately sent telegrams to governments all over the world, pleading with them, saying, if I can get the children out at least, will you allow them to come to your country? Only 2 countries said yes. Even the U.S. said no. Only his own Britain and Sweden said yes. So he went to work knowing the clock was ticking. Before it was all over, he will arrange 9 rail transports of children out of Prague to foster families, mostly in Britain and a few in Sweden. The only reason he was not able to talk about this for 50 years was what happened to the 9th transport. It was the biggest of all, 250. The others had a total of 669 kids, the first 8 transports. The 9th had 250. They were all at Prague Station, ready to go, foster families waiting for them on the 1st of September, 1939. The day the war broke out, the Nazis stopped all rail transports, and not a single one of those 250 children survived. Nicky Winton, for the next half century, couldn't talk about it. We would have loved to have heard the story long before we did, which tells you that he did what he could do, not for fame or fortune, but because he felt it was the right thing to do. But he just couldn't talk about it because of what happened to the largest group of all. Well, later when the story did come out, he was celebrated and knighted as a great humanitarian hero. His story, and there are others like that too, are evidence that character not only enriches life, it can save life. Thank God for people of character who speak truth to power, who do what they know to be right, no matter what the odds may be, at often great sacrifice or expense to themselves. That's what makes them heroes. We like to tell our student audiences so often that it's never too soon to commit yourself to a life of character. Never too soon. And it's something you'll never regret. You want to put yourself in a position now and for the rest of your life so that you can look back on your life someday and say something like what the Apostle Paul said the night before his martyrdom, when he said, I have fought the fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. That's the position you want to put yourself in. You don't want to have to look back on a life of regret and say, oh, so many times I knew what was right, I didn't commit myself to it, or I cut corners, I did something else just to get by, and what have I done? So, my last word is commit yourself to a life of character. You'll never regret it, and you too can be a hero. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.